Everybody's here nice and bright and early this morning. I had my coffee, so I'm ready to talk. So, what we're going to go over this morning is basically the exact same presentation that myself and Michael Miller from Sunoco gave at SEMA, at the SEMA show back last fall. I feel like it's very relevant to the Hot Rod Industry Association because most of our classic hot rods do have carburetors on them, and most of us go get our gasoline at the gas station. We're not using leaded fuels, non-oxidated fuels. So when you're going to a gas station and you're getting gas, there's going to be ethanol in the fuel, and we need to understand what the effects of ethanol are on carburetors because they are significant. It is not a fuel injection system, so it does behave differently. So with that said, let's hop into it because you look at the picture, that may or may not look familiar, not the carburetor itself, but the nasty corrosion and gunk inside of it. By the way, that's one tank of fuel in 9 months. So 9 months before that picture was taken, that carburetor was basically brand new. Reproduction piece that was clean and good. Engine was assembled. It was dynoed on pump gas. Engine set for 9 months. They went to go fire it up again, and it wouldn't idle right. Tried all kinds of different things. Eventually pulled the carburetor apart, and that's what they found inside. That's not all that uncommon, actually. Especially talking to different engine builders and carburetor manufacturers, they see this stuff all the time. So a little bit of background to this. Mike's not here. I'll kind of talk for him. Mike is the technical manager at Sunoco Performance Products, Sunoco Race Fuels. Mike's background, he's a mechanical engineer. He's worked for Sunoco for many years, worked on the passenger car fuel side, worked on diesel fuels, and is now basically the technical director for Sunoco Race Fuels, which is the official fuel supplier for NASCAR, LMS, IndyCar. I think they're probably the largest race fuel supplier in the whole world in terms of total volume. They actually have their own distillation towers. They actually manufacture their own fuels, not just blend. So they're pretty unique in that regards. Me and Mike have been friends for over 10 years. I'm Lake Speed Jr. Like Joe said, I'm the head of R&D for Driven Racing Oil, which we're a spinoff from Joe Gibbs Racing. We've been doing the oils and lubricants and stuff for Joe Gibbs Racing for about 15 years. I'm a member of a group called the Society of Tribologists and Lubrication Engineers, basically the Oil Geeks Club. And within that group, I'm one of less than 300 people in the whole world that's a certified lubrication specialist and an oil monitoring analyst, which makes me like a king of the oil geeks, right? Or pretty close. There's like chieftains above me, but I'm into hydrocarbons. Anyway, so with that kind of background on who we are, where this information come from, let me give you a little quick background on ethanol, right? Ethanol is the buzzword when it comes to fuels and all these things. For anybody who happens to be a Breaking Bad fan, which I'm a huge fan of, let's get into the chemistry of it real quick. Basically, ethanol is ethyl alcohol. All right, same stuff. If you go drink a glass of wine or drink a glass of beer, there's ethyl alcohol in that, right? That's the chemistry equation for it. It is the same thing as grain alcohol. It is used as an oxygenant for emissions purposes. As you can see from the chemistry there, to the right of the second C, you'll see an O between the C and the H. All right, that oxygen molecule is what brings oxygen to the molecule. That oxygen is what helps aid in emissions, right? Oxygen helps also increase the octane of the fuel. Problem with ethanol is it's hygroscopic. It likes moisture. So as you can probably imagine, water is H2O, and you see some H's and some O's up there. So yeah, they all get along. Like kinds like to stay together. Other thing is interesting to know is on the ASTM, which is the basically the Society for Testing and Materials. They're the guys who set the fuel standards for the whole world. This is verbatim from the ASTM fuel standard. Some fuels corrode fuel system metals other than copper, but there is no ASTM test method to evaluate corrosion of these metals. Depending on the type and concentration of the oxygenant, gasoline oxygenate blends can corrode metals such as zinc, magnesium, aluminum, and steel. If you think about the fuel system in any carbureted vehicle, you'll realize there's a whole lot of pieces that are zinc, magnesium, aluminum, and steel. Your carburetor is typically going to be an alloy of aluminum, where the alloying agents are typically either zinc or magnesium. Most Holley carburetors have a zinc casting on the outside of them, a zinc plating. And then your fuel pumps are typically steel. So when you look at these, the fuel spec, and you say, oh, they know this is a problem, but they can't agree on any test method to actually quantify it, they just move on. And the difference between a carburetor, we'll cover it in a minute. So this is the key background to know about ethanol and why it's bad for carburetors. And our experience is, NASCAR began using E15 in 2011, which is a year before they switched to fuel injection. So for 1 year, Cup cars ran on E15 with carburetors. And we went from having to never rebuild a carburetor to having to rebuild carburetors every race. Because, NASCAR, we run, perfect example, right? So this weekend, they're racing at Las Vegas, 1.5 mile track. Last week, they were at Phoenix, 1 mile track. Week before that, they're at Daytona, 2.5 mile track. Guess what they don't run at all three of those tracks, or they wouldn't have in 2011? Same carburetor, right? Same carburetor rule for every track, but Daytona, Talladega, they actually built a carburetor different for wide open throttle on a restricted plate motor, different carburetor than you run at Phoenix, which is a short track where you need more throttle response. Las Vegas, because it's a high bank intermediate track, you build a carburetor that gives you better mid-range power. So you can actually build the carburetors differently in order to affect the power band of the engine. So as a result, we don't run the same carburetor every single weekend. So when you would cycle back around to that same kind of track again, where you'd need that same carburetor again, with the old leaded fuels, we never had any issue. You could take a carburetor off and sit it there, and it'd run just fine next time you put it back on the car. With the E15, every time you raced the car, you had to rebuild the carburetor. Today, in the Nationwide series, we still run carburetors, and the Truck series, and the engine tuners rebuild the carburetor after every single race. The ethanol guys don't like you talking about that, but that's the reality, So when that started happening, we actually went back to Lubrizol, and most people don't realize that in the world of fuel and lubricants, there's a lot of companies that market products. There are very few companies that make products. Most gasoline marketers don't own their own refineries. Most people know, in a given area, there may be only 1 or 2 refineries, so all the gasoline in that area comes from those 2 refineries. Or in some cases, it's only 1 refinery. The difference is between the different fuels are the additives they put in them. There are only 4 companies in the whole world that make fuel additives. Also 4 companies that make oil additives. Same 4 companies. Not household brands, by the way. Lubrizol, Athens Chemical, Chevron Oronite, and Infineum. Oronite is obviously part of Chevron. Infineum is a joint venture between Shell and ExxonMobil. Afton is the old Ethyl Corporation, the guys that make tetraethyl lead. So any leaded fuel in the whole world, the additives come from Afton. Lubrizol is the largest of the 4. They're the oldest of the 4. And they're the guys that invented zinc dialkyl-phosphate, which for the oil guys, that's the ZDP, the zinc that's in your motor oil that keeps your can alive. Those are the guys that make it. Just another little tidbit, Lubrizol, Warren Buffett's Berkshire Hathaway bought them about 1.5 years ago for $9.7 billion. So they're a small little company. We went with them. That's who actually makes the oil stuff for us. We went to them and asked them, okay, listen, we're having these problems with carburetors. Is there some kind of additive or something we could, at least flush the carburetors with to try to help protect these things? NASCAR won't let us put anything in the fuel because they're too afraid we're going to try to cheat and try to make more horsepower or something. So they said, yeah, actually, we've been doing, high ethanol blended fuels down in Brazil for 40 years. We know the exact right kind of additives to put in there for corrosion inhibitors, and you can use this to help flush the carburetor after the race, and it'll help buy you some time and keep the parts alive longer. So we started doing that, and it worked really good. We actually work with a guy named Willie Krupp, has a business called Willie's Carbs. He's over in Mount Carmel, Illinois, and he does a lot of dirt track, modified carburetors and stuff. We started working with Willie and said, hey, listen, here, why don't you try this stuff in some series where you can actually put additives in the fuel? And there's a lot of guys in the Midwest run on E85 because it's basically cheap race fuel. If you're a racer, straight methanol is about $8 a gallon at the racetrack. You can go to the gas station and buy E85 for less than $4 a gallon. So it's really cheap race fuel, for a lot of guys. The problem is E85 will absolutely eat a carburetor from the inside out. So we went to Willie, gave him the additive. He started using it, and it basically eliminated the corrosion issues they were having, the deposit issues they were having. So one of the cool things we did with him, though, is when we started working with him was he actually sent us some carburetor parts. And this is where it got really interesting. So he sent us some carburetor parts. And so we sent them to Lubrizol. It's okay, here's some parts that have had, those kind of deposits on them, right? And we kind of, what we know, okay, we see all these issues showing up on anything that's got E10 or higher. They're showing up in circle track cars, drag race cars, street rods, variety of fuels. The one thing that was in common is these things tend to sit around. They all have an off season. That's the one common factor. That and there's ethanol in the fuel at some concentration. So we sent the parts, here's some pictures of them, off to the guys at Lubrizol. The engineers at Lubrizol had to Google what a carburetor was to know what parts we sent them. We didn't send them the whole carburetor put together. We sent them metering blocks, float bowls, jets. They had no idea what they're looking at. Because the reality is, it's an antique, right? There's 4 companies that make these fuel additives. The one common factor amongst all 4 companies is they never test any fuel additives in a carburetor. You can go to all their shops. Lubrizol's over in Cleveland, Ohio. They have an immaculate R&D facility. They have 16 dyno cells that run 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. There is another common factor amongst those cells. There is not a carburetor on a single engine in any of them. They all run on fuel injection. So everything they develop is based around a fuel injection system. And right now, the only thing they care about is direct injection. They're not even thinking about a carburetor. So when we gave them a carburetor, they had no idea what it was even made out of or what parts they were looking at until they were able to Google it. So that's just a real basis we have to understand when it comes to how these modern fuels are affecting carburetors is, one, ASTM knows that ethanol causes corrosion. The guys that make the additives are unaware of the material properties of a carburetor, nor do they care. Right, that's a fundamental basis of knowledge we have to approach and look at this with. So you can see the white deposits and stuff, and they were really curious, okay, what are these deposits? Is this deposit coming from the fuel? Or is this something coming from the material itself? And what we found was when they took the pieces, they used a really high-tech piece of equipment called an EDS, which is an X-ray dispersive spectroscopy. You can actually look and it will tell you the elemental concentration. So it tells you what the atoms are that make up that material. So when you look at the light deposit, it's about 18% carbon, 38% oxygen, 39% zinc. That white stuff is zinc oxide, right? There's no zinc in the fuel, but there is oxygen in the fuel. There's no oxygen, there is zinc on the carburetor, but no oxygen in the carburetor. That is where the oxygen in the ethanol is reacting with the zinc on the carburetor and creating zinc oxide. All right, so you're eating the carburetor from the inside out. By the way, zinc oxide is the same stuff that you put in sunscreen, and is also the same stuff you use to make ZDDP from. So it's kind of funny how all this oil and fuel stuff all turns back to zinc. So there's another little higher resolution picture of it. As you can see, the deposits forming, going up. And what was really interesting is, because we know now that that zinc oxide, so that white material is actually coming from the material of the carburetor reacting with the fuel, we weren't surprised when you ground that away that you found pitting and corrosion. Because every time you see white that was eating away that material, there is now holes. As you drill in closer, you can see it's just eating away at the material, and as it gets past the harder outer layer, it gets into the softer underside, it gets even worse and the pits get even bigger, much like the roads around here. Right? A little more high-tech photographs of it, but you get the idea that the corrosion is eating away at the surface. It's just corroding and killing, which is why at some point, if the corrosion goes on long enough, your carburetor is junk and you got to buy a new one. There's just too much material damage to fix it. So this is what the ethanol does to the carburetor, and it's very much a function of time and temperature and concentration. The higher the concentration of the ethanol, the shorter amount of time it's going to take for this to happen. Even at a low concentration, if you have enough time, it will do it. And then the temperature factor is because moisture will speed this process up, and the fuels do want to absorb moisture. The hotter the fuel, the more moisture it can absorb. But then when the fuel cools, the moisture wants to separate. Phase separation, which is kind of a buzzword in all this stuff, is a function of temperature swings and exposure to humidity. It's not something that can be prevented. There's nothing you can put in the fuel that will make it not happen. That's bogus. It's merely a function of exposure and temperature swings, which is why, in some places where you have really, really hot, humid summers and really, really cold winters, you see it, especially in marine applications. That's why they see it worse, because they have the highest humidity exposure, is typically operated, in warm environments, and then it's put away into a very cold environment, set for a long time. That's why the marine guys see this first, because they have the worst environment for it. So it's very much an environmentally based challenge as well. So again, we went back, worked with Lubrizol, worked with Willys, worked with BLP, a couple of carburetor guys, let them test some of these different additives for corrosion protection, and found that, when you use the correct type of additive for ethanol, even in E85 and pure methanol, that with the correct additive in the fuel, you could prevent corrosion, even if the car ran for the entire season and you never flushed the carburetor, you never rebuilt it, never did anything, you could do it. And then in dyno testing with the guys at BLP, we were able to prove that the low concentration of the correct type of additive does not change the performance of the fuel. It doesn't change the specific gravity of the fuel, so there's no change in jetting. There's no change in timing, because it doesn't affect the octane of the fuel. All right, that's really key. You don't want to put anything in there that changes the fuel, because now you don't know what the fuel is. You map on one thing or tune on one thing, and then you put in an additive after the fact, and it changes how the fuel performs. Well, now you're off, especially when we found out what most of these other additives in the market are made out of. It's very scary what some of that stuff is. There are some pictures of carburetor that ran on E85 for an entire season without any rebuilds, just the additive. So that kind of gives you a little bit of a view on what's happening with that side. So what can you do? Number one, most important thing is, if it's at all possible, avoid using ethanol. All right, I think there's a place called Free Gas, or there's a couple of different websites that you can help you find ethanol-free gas stations where they are able to sell non-ethanol gasoline. That's good if you can find that. Probably let's say you're going on the hot rod power tour, that's going to be a really tough deal, to drive the whole week and be able to fill up with the ethanol-free gas every single time. So if you can't, then you need to use some kind of chemistry to do it, to prevent the corrosion, stabilize the fuel, to do those kind of things. And then obviously your storage becomes a big thing to think of. And this is where Mike gave us some really good guidance, and I'll kind of do this part. Obviously when you're talking about race cars, muscle cars, vintage cars, large collections and those kind of things, if you can use a race fuel, again back to the not using pump gas, inherently those fuels are more stable. They're made from higher quality components that are less volatile, that will stay good longer. They're harder to get, they cost a whole lot more money. But from a technical standpoint, they are a better choice where possible. Typically they have antioxidants in them, metal deactivators, corrosion inhibitors, which are the things you want, which are basically the same things that are in the additive that we sell. Those same three things to try to prevent the corrosion. Those are already in race fuels. Those are expensive items, expensive molecules. They typically don't end up in pump fuels, especially cheap pump fuels have very little of them. That's why some of the premium gases do work better, because they typically contain more. So in this scenario, the more you have of them, the better off you are, the longer your car sits, and the higher the ethanol content is. So it's kind of that chemistry balance. Other part is, from a very practical standpoint, back to, okay, well, how do you prevent phase separation? Keep the tanks full. If you have half a tank of gas in an old hot rod where the fuel system is vented to the atmosphere, if you have half a tank of gas, you have a lot of headspace in there that allows the fuel to breathe. And as the fuel breathes, you can get more moisture in there. If it's full all the way up into the filler neck, now my exposure area is maybe this big around as opposed to being that big around. And that makes a key difference in how much moisture the fuel can absorb, right? And at what point phase separation occurs. Other thing is, if the temperature swings can be minimized, the thing's not sitting out in the sun, so it gets really, really warm during the day and really, really cold at night. If you can keep it in a garage, if you can maintain a closer temperature in the garage, and if it's attached to the house as opposed to separate from the house, those kind of things all help extend the life of the fuel, because it's keeping those environmental factors to a minimum. Sunlight is another one. We've seen this several times. The worst thing you can do is have a clear fuel jug or a light colored fuel jug and leave the fuel out in the sun. That will dramatically shorten the life of the fuel. The UV rays do massive damage to the fuel, speeds up oxidation. Again, the temperature, the heat from the sunlight obviously causes things to breathe because of the heat. An opaque one, like a steel container, is actually better than a plastic one. Plastic containers do breathe. You wouldn't think that this bottle can breathe. Our engineers one time at Gibbs did some testing on bottles of Dasani where they would heat and cool the bottles of Dasani, and they were actually able to measure a weight reduction in the bottle by temperature cycling the bottle. You're no way. Yep. If they temperature cycle it enough, they can actually measure a weight reduction in the bottle. So even plastic sealed stuff does breathe. From the fuel side, Sunoco, obviously, they have the Standard, the Supreme, which are conventional loaded race fuels, more expensive, harder to get. Sunoco Optima is a unleaded fuel with no alcohol. It's actually designed for small engines. It's for design, and it was kind of optimized for car collections where they know they have cars that are going to sit for a long period of time. And the reality is the people that own the cars have enough money that they don't really care what the fuel cost because the value of the car is so high, they'll go buy it. Or you have, say, fleets of small engines that sit for 6 months and then work really hard for 6 months. They use it as storage fuel. So there's a lot of options you can look at when it comes to how do I store the fuel? Do I put an additive in it? What kind of fuel do I use? All these things are paths and ways you can go about trying to circumvent the problem. The reality on the impact of this is a little bit of research. There are over 42 million carbureted vehicles in the U.S. and Canada. It's a lot. It's a lot. And that doesn't even count the small engine in the Marine. And every single one of them has a problem with ethanol, which is why you hear everybody complaining about it. So it's a major issue. The scary fact is that, and when we do this, people say, well, what about the fuel additives I can go buy at AutoZone? Now, I can go down to AutoZone or Pep Boys or O'Reilly's or whatever, and there's going to be about 5 different brands of fuel additives on the shelf, most of them making some kind of claim about ethanol this or fuel system cleaner for that. Besides Chevron Techron, which is a good product, pretty much the rest of those things are 95% solvent or contain alcohol. And I'm, again, not picking on any brands, just go look at the MSDS sheet. I'm just telling you what the truth is. Most of them contain less than 5% actual additive. Most of it is a solvent. The solvent's in there to be a cleaner. But solvent is not active chemistry for corrosion protection. It doesn't provide deposit control. It doesn't provide antioxidancy, which is basically for fuel stabilization, for fuel life. 5% fuel stabilizer is good, but if you could spend basically the same money and get 20% additive, would you rather have 20%? Seems like a no-brainer to me. The really scary fact is that most of the fuel additives on the shelf at a parts store actually contain alcohol. The primary ingredient in most of those additives is isopropyl alcohol, which is basically rubbing alcohol. And because alcohol is a great solvent, and it absorbs water. So they're trying to use it as a dry gas to prevent phase separation. Problem is, we can go back to the first slide and say, what's the problem with alcohol? It's corrosive. So we're putting a higher corrosive agent in the fuel. So that's a big problem, which is why most of what's on the shelf, with a couple of exceptions, it actually is not good for a carbureted vehicle by any means in terms of storage protection. Questions?